Hello students, this is Dr. Faizad Mirza. I am discussing some working definitions of selection and evolution with you in this video. What's evolution? The general theory of evolution, the general idea of evolution, that evolution basically is a process of leading to formation of new species. And these new species, they are forming because of pre-existing species over the course of time. Variation? Variation actually refers to that all individuals of the same species are not exactly alike. They are a set of varying features and variation exists between them. What's continuous variation? Continuous variation actually encompasses the idea that there is difference between individuals of a species in which one can lie at any point in the range between the highest and the lowest values. In discontinuous variation, however, we have discrete categories. The difference between individuals of a species in which each one belongs to a small number of distinct categories. And there are no intermediates in this case. For example, in continuous variation, you can consider the skin pigment, because the skin pigment in humans is of the entire range from a very dark melanin pigment to someone who is albino. And we have individuals in the range of all the skin pigments can be found in human beings. And the same goes for obesity as well. You can have people who are extremely obese, you can have people who are very emaciated, and you have a range of individuals who are in between as well. In discontinuous, however, we'll have individuals in a particular category. For example, individuals having a blood group A or blood group AB or blood group O, or for example, blood group B, or whatever. The blood group is a discrete category in which a person falls in. Similarly, the beta chain of hemoglobin, whether the individual is having sickle cell anemia or the person is a carrier of sickle cell trait, the person is normal HbA. So there are three categories there. So there is no intermediate between them. So that's discontinuous variation. When we come to genetic variation, basically genetic variation means that there is a difference between the DNA based sequences of individuals within a species. And this could be because of silent mutation. In silent mutation, you can recall that the codon has changed, whereas the amino acid stays the same. Phenotypic variation, on the other hand, is basically the differences between the observable features of the individual within a species or within an individual species. What's polymorphism? Polymorphism means that there will be a continued existence of two or more than two phenotypes, distinct phenotypes of the same species. For example, you can see black swan and white swan, both can be seen. Similarly, peppered moth, black and white, can be seen. So these are two distinct phenotypes, or for example, gray squirrel and red squirrel. That's polymorphism. Polygenes means that there are a number of genes at different loci, and these different genes at different loci, they act together and contribute to a particular phenotype or a trait. What's an environmental factor? An environmental factor basically is a feature of the environment of an organism, and this feature of the environment of the organism affects its survival. For example, biotic factors are the living components of the environment, and these living components actually determine the survival of the organisms in that vicinity. For example, competition, for example, predation. And similarly, abiotic factors, these are also environmental factors, but these are the environmental factors which are not directly living, rather they are non-living. And these non-living components can be, for example, soil pH or light intensity or water availability, for instance. The idea of competition basically is that there is a need for a resource by two organisms, and the resource is in limited quantity or is in a short supply. Then there will be competition between them. Fitness refers to that there is an ability, that this is the ability, or this is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. Because when the organism will reproduce, the organism will pass the alleles to the next generation, and organisms with one phenotype are more likely to survive than those with the different phenotype. For example, if you have white peppered moth and you have black peppered moth, and the tree trunks are black or dark, We know that peppered moths settle on tree trunks to rest on days during the daylight hours. So if the dark peppered moth is resting on a dark tree trunk, it's definitely going to get a better camouflage, so that its chances of survival and passing on the same phenotype and the alleles to the next generation are higher as compared to a white peppered moth settled on the black tree trunk, because it won't be able to have a good camouflage there. So that basically deals with fitness. So again, polymorphism is linked with fitness. You can probably just relate that. What's natural selection? Natural selection refers to the selection pressures which are exerted by nature. And these natural selection pressures, the individuals which are better adapted to selection pressures, they survive. And not just individuals, but the alleles of that confer advantage, they get selected as well. So individuals less suited are unable to survive, and this reduces the chance of those alleles or the less suited individuals surviving and reproducing. So the alleles eventually are lost from the population. We discussed stabilizing selection, where things are kept the way they are, directional selection, in which a new allele gets favored, or disruptive selection, in which the intermediate gets selected against. What's a stabilizing selection? As already I just mentioned, stabilizing selection is basically the natural selection that tends to keep allele frequencies in the same order, relatively as constant as they were initially, for many generations. What's directional selection? In directional selection, stabilizing selection would not occur. Rather, the natural selection here, it would cause gradual change in allele frequencies over the time, and this will be over many generations. And certain allele frequency will start to increase as compared to the others. Similarly, disruptive selection. In disruptive selection, the natural selection that maintains relatively high frequencies of two different sets of alleles, that's disruptive selection, and individuals with intermediate features of the two and the alleles are not selected, and they are omitted from the environment. What's gene pool? Gene pool is the complete range of the DNA base sequences, genes, together with all the alleles in all the organisms in a species or population. What's founder's effect? I'll come to founder's effect in detail later on as well. So founder's effect is the reduction in the gene pool as compared with the main population. So here isolation will be involved. That a portion of the species will be, a portion of organisms from the larger ones will be isolated, and the new population will arise only from few individuals. They will start the new population. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is a gradual change in allele frequencies, and this gradual change in allele frequencies occur in small population where some alleles are lost altogether or favored just by chance and not by natural selection. We'll come to genetic drift again. I'll be discussing founder's effect in detail later as well, so we'll cover that as well. So moving on from gene pool, we have artificial selection. What's artificial selection? Artificial selection is the selection in which the selection pressures are exerted by humans and not the nature. In this case, organisms with desirable traits or desired traits are crossed together, and they are selected to survive and reproduce. When they are selected to survive and reproduce, they pass on the desirable traits and alleles to the next generation, and the offspring still carry the same alleles in the same frequencies as the humans want, or as we want. That's called selective breeding. Outbreeding. Outbreeding is breeding between individuals that are not closely related. What is hybrid vigor? Hybrid vigor is increase in the survival ability as well as the better growth of an organism, and this occurs due to outbreeding. This leads to hybrid vigor. It promotes heterozygosity because those individuals will have more heterozygous features rather than homozygous recessive traits. Inbreeding depression is the loss of ability to survive and grow well. This is because the breeding between close relatives or close related organisms. This promotes homozygosity. More homozygous recessive traits they start to accumulate, and we know that most genetic disorders are recessive alleles. So recessive traits accumulate, and this leads to an increased chance of harmful recessive alleles to come together, and the population actually ends up becoming less fit. Inbreeding is breeding between organisms that are closely related to one another. So inbreeding actually leads to inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression actually refers to the loss of heterozygosity or promoting homozygosity. And how do you counter this? You counter this by outbreeding, because outbreeding then promotes hybrid vigor. When we define species, a species is basically a group of organisms with similar morphological, physiological, biochemical, and behavioral features that can interbreed to produce fertile offsprings. What are morphological features? These are structural features. What are physiological features? They are related to metabolic or other processes that occur in the living organism. Speciation is the process of production of new species. Endemic species is a species that's found in just one area on Earth, on one region, and not nowhere else. We discuss reproductive isolation here as well. So what's reproductive isolation? Reproductive isolation is the inability of two groups of organisms to breed. And when they cannot breed with another, they cannot yield an offspring. The two populations of the same species may be isolated over time, and this isolation could either be geographically isolated or they could be genetically isolated. What do you mean by geographical isolation? Geographical means that here the separation is by a geographical barrier, and for example, there is a stretch of water or a mountain or a crater or anything that cannot be surpassed by the organisms of that individual species. Whereas genetic isolation refers to species that are no longer breeding together, and exchange of genes is just not occurring. So that's the basic difference of there is no gene flow in genetic isolation. Geographic isolation, there is no gene flow because there is of geographical isolation at the base. Ecological separation, we are discussing ecological and behavioral separation here. Ecological separation refers to two populations that cannot breed together because they live in different environments of the same area. For example, living in the middle of the lake and the bottom of the lake, or living at certain altitude on the mountain. For example, Markhors, they live in Pakistan. Markhor, they live at the highest or the tallest peaks, and below those, at a much lower altitude, we have ibex living, and at a much lower altitude, we have blue sheep living. So they are ecologically separated. Similarly, behavioral separation refers to two populations that cannot breed together because they have different behaviors that prevent them from breeding at all. That basically sums up the basic working definitions of this chapter. That's it from my side. Thank you.